Hello, it's David Leroy here, and this slide presentation is on interviewing children, and I'm going to be talking about the development of the NICHD protocol. So it's fair to say that over the previous decades we've learnt a lot about how to interview children and the context in which they're going to be able to produce the most accurate and reliable testimony. And with all of this knowledge, the question that a lot of professionals have asked themselves is, well, how can we train forensic interviewers? What is it that we need to be able to give them from our very large knowledge base that's going to allow them to be able to conduct forensically competent interviews with young children who are often alleging sexual and physical abuse? So if you look around the world, what you will see is many forensic interviews are trained. And often the people doing this training are tasked with, coming up with a training program. And what you see is quite a lot of consistency in the content of training programs. And, typically the type of people that would be attending these types of training programs would be social workers and police. And in some jurisdictions there'll be psychologists involved and so forth, but in the United Kingdom in particular, it's usually social workers and police that are conducting forensic interviews with children, and so they'll attend often a week-long training program. That's a good amount of time to be able to learn what you need to know in order to conduct forensic interviews. Some training programs are a little bit shorter, some are longer, some are spread over many weeks, where interviewers might come and do one day of training, every day for 5 weeks. But in those training sessions, interviewers will be expected to, have in their possession their local guidelines, and most jurisdictions will produce interview guidelines, with like specific requirements that are particular to the jurisdictions that the interviewers are going to be conducting the interviews in. They will also be taught by their trainers about the different types of questions, the pros and cons of using different types of questions, with the overarching recommendation that interviewers should be using open prompts wherever possible to facilitate children's communication. Interviewers will also need to learn about developmental issues. Um, Even if you're an interviewer that has your own children, there are still things that we need to know about child development in terms of having realistic expectations of children as they cognitively develop over their lifespans. Interviewers are often taught about some of the pitfalls of the past, so they will learn about suggestibility, they will learn about the context of criminal proceedings, and this can influence the types of information that interviewers are going to seek in particular jurisdictions. For example, one jurisdiction I've worked in, will have different types of charges depending on whether the alleged crime committed occurred above the age of 12 or below the age of 12. So, often to meet the context of criminal proceedings, interviewers will need to have made sure that they've probed for information about exactly when the alleged events might have occurred. On the training most interviewers receive here in the United Kingdom and also around the world, there will be opportunities for interviewers to practice their skills. So this can often involve trained actors coming along to the training sessions. They will have, rooms, maybe some video equipment set up. The actors will be given a scenario of abuse, and they'll be told to, think about, what it would be like to be that child. Someone's going to question you about that scenario, and then they'll be encouraged to respond to the interviewer's questions so that the interviewer can then practice using the skills that they've been taught. And it's also important for interviewers to get some feedback about how good their practice interviews are during the training. So the trainers will inevitably have to watch the practice interviews live, take notes, and then immediately after the training, sit down with the interviewer and talk through some of their strengths and also some points that they might be able to improve on. An alternative is that sometimes these practice interviews could be recorded and interviewers can, go away and listen to them themselves, and then a discussion could take place after both sides have, had time to, really think and analyze how the interview has gone. In the United Kingdom, um, the training here is done under the direction of the Achieving Best Evidence document. And in Scotland, they have the same types of recommendations, but they call them JIIs, Joint Investigative Interviews. And so there's guidelines throughout the UK that influence the way people are trained to conduct forensic interviews here. And the first training manual that was produced was in the 1990s, and that's called the Memorandum of Good Practice. So that was in the UK a starting point, where people were able to, produce very practical guidelines for forensic interviewers to try and help them do the very difficult job that they're going to be asked to do. So if you imagine you're a forensic interviewer, you've been asked to attend some training, you learn all of the developmental characteristics that are required for the job, you learn about children's cognitive and emotional functioning and well-being. So the question is, if someone has sat through a week-long training session and they've learnt all about this and they've had opportunities to practice their interviews, they've had feedback, what happens? How effective is that training? Does telling interviewers what to do in training sessions translate into conducting good interviews? And this is a really, really critical question because a lot of work has gone into the underpinning research. Of course, a lot of work has gone into producing guidelines and operationalizing the research. And then for the trainers, there's a lot of work in delivering training for a week. And what everyone would hope is that, given the research base, the effort that's gone into producing guidelines and the high quality training interviewers receive, you'd want that to see that translating into good interviews. So you'd want to see an improvement in the types of interviews. And an improvement in interviews would be seeing people adopting more developmentally appropriate and safe parts of their forensic interview repertoire. And you would also want to see interviewers avoiding using techniques that are known to cause errors and make it more difficult for children to be able to communicate their experiences to an interviewer. So what does the research tell us about that? That's the critical question. I want to talk first of all about a study that was conducted in England and Wales in 2000 by Michael Lamb and colleagues. And this is called the MOGP study, the Memorandum of Good Practice study. So shortly before this study was published in the decade before, there had been a great effort made by practitioners and researchers to implement some of the best practice ideas within training systems. And so what these researchers wanted to look at was, okay, well, now that we've attempted to operationalize a lot of this, really good advice, we know the content of the training that interviewers are going to be receive is appropriate. Well, has that translated into good quality interviews? And that was the central question that these investigators were interested in. And so what they did is they got a sample of 119 children. All of these children had made allegations of abuse that in some ways was substantiated, and that's an important feature of research like this. You would want to make sure that you're studying the skills of interviewers when they're talking to children that actually have something to say. And that something is usually going to be allegations of physical and sexual abuse. The children were mostly female and aged between 4 and 13 years old. And the types of things that they were alleging were would be considered within legal context pretty serious types of allegations that involve inappropriate touching, exposure by suspects of their genitals, and also ranging to completed penetration. Most of the children um, reported multiple instances of abuse when they were interviewed, and most of the perpetrators were people that were known to the child. And so if you think of that dynamic in child abuse investigations, that in itself can make it quite difficult for young children to feel comfortable and confident about talking about the misdeeds of a grown-up that they know. So the people conducting the interviews in this study were mainly police officers, and they'd all attended the training I was talking about in the previous slide. So they all knew um, what they should be doing. They'd been told that. They'd had an opportunity to practice their interviews and get a little bit of feedback. But then they finished the training and they're back in their workplaces, child protection units, and so forth, and interviews will need to be conducted, and then it becomes their job to do the interviews for real following training. And so it's those interviews that we're really interested in looking at the quality of. And I'm just going to talk about one dimension of interview quality for the purposes of this example and slide presentation, and that's to do with the quality of the actual questioning, because this is a really fundamental part of interviewing to get right. There's lots and lots of aspects of forensic interviews and forensic interviewing that are very, very important, but fundamental to making those types of advances in other areas is getting the questioning right in the first place. And so during the training, as I've mentioned, interviewers will be encouraged to use open prompts. And when the researchers looked at the sample of interviews, they would have had to have gone through them all line by line. They would have had to have taken the DVDs or VHS tapes. They would have had to have sat down with headphones in front of a computer, transcribed them all word for word. And then following that, they would have had teams of people going through each line and looking at exactly the form of question that was asked by the interviewer. And having gone through all of those interviews and counting up all of the different types of questions that were asked and the prompts that were used, what the researchers found was that only 7% of the interviewer prompts were of the variety that were recommended in the training. And so you can see here in the study that was conducted in England and Wales on interviewers that had been trained with the Memorandum of Good Practice, only 7% of the utterances prompts that the interviewers were using were of the type that were recommended, the open prompts. You can see in the pie chart that most of the questions that interviewers are using are of the directive type, which are the what, when, where type questions, or option posing questions. Right? And there are known problems with this type of question in terms of them increasing misunderstandings and eliciting incorrect information. And so that's what happened that's the results of the research from England and Wales that was conducted in 2000. So they're disappointing findings. It's quite discouraging if you were to put all the effort into, conducting research, analysing the research, writing reviews, producing interview guidelines, developing training protocols, putting the effort into training, then you let the interviewers out into the into the environment where they're going to be conducting these interviews for real, and then you find that they're really not able to put into practice everything that they've been taught. And that's not just a problem for forensic interviewers in England and Wales. Exactly the same type of study was also conducted in the United States, with interviewers that had been trained in a very similar fashion. They were in possession of the same type of knowledge. But then when their interviews were looked at, that they were conducting during the investigations, what the researchers in the United States found is that only 10% of the prompts were open. And this is again a low number of the recommended prompts being deployed during the forensic interviews. So again, it's a disappointing result in the United States research. And then if we have a look at similar studies that have been conducted in Israel and in Sweden, you see a very similar pattern. There is low numbers of open prompts being used by the interviewers. And interviewers in all of these different study sites would have been on training programs that would have been operationalizing some pretty good advice about how to conduct forensic interviews. So one other study that was conducted by myself and colleagues in Scotland, this was not a highly controlled study. This was a study of forensic interviews that had come to me as I provided expert advice in legal cases. So in my capacity as an expert witness, I would be sent transcripts of forensic interviews and asked to evaluate them. So I had evaluations after some time of quite a few forensic interviews, and I decided to publish those in a law journal in Scotland. So I ended up with 37 interviews, and I was just interested in asking the same question. Are the interviewers using open prompts? My hunch was that they would not be, because when I was working on individual cases, it was very frequently the case that you would see very few open prompts being used in the forensic interviews. And this is the data that I obtained. So in the interviews I analysed that had come to me in my capacity as working as an expert witness, 8% of the utterances were open prompts. And that's a very similar type of finding as in the other larger studies that have been conducted in the United Kingdom, United States, Israel and Sweden that I've just shown you. And you can see here also there's a very high dependence by the interviewers on using the directive WH questions and option posing yes-no type questions. So that is disappointing. We can conclude that interviewers must struggle to interview children to obtain credible evidence. So they've been trained, but they aren't able, it seems, to be able to put into practice the advice that they've been given. And the key piece of that advice was to use open prompts when they're questioning children. So is there a solution to this? Right, we've got a lot of knowledge and we want to see obvious improvements in the quality of forensic interviews, especially around the questioning of children. What's the solution to this? Well, researchers thought about what else might be able to happen. And in the United States, at the National Institutes of Health, researchers there developed the NICHD protocol. And NICHD stands for National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. And the NICHD protocol is an evidence-based approach to the forensic interviewing of children, and it was developed in collaboration with a very large team of researchers and, importantly, practitioners. So the people who developed this protocol weren't academics sitting in a university isolated from the real world problems. It was, yes, researchers and academics, but they were developing this protocol in collaboration with police officers, youth investigators, experienced forensic interviewer trainers, senior police officers, and also legal expertise was involved in the development of the protocol. They also sought advice from defense expert witnesses. So right from the outset, the development of this protocol was, designed to, take into account all of the children's developmental characteristics, so that it was a developmentally appropriate type of interview that would be able to be provided. But it was also designed to be sort of legally sound, so that it would survive legal challenge as cases progressed through the legal system that had used a protocol like this. Um, the structured protocol has a series of phases, and what practitioners refer to is the phased approach. And this phased approach is one where you want to first of all itemize the different types of things that interviewers should do at different stages of the interview. And this isn't just a feature of the NICHD protocol. Most forensic interview protocols that have been developed have a similar type of phase. Sometimes there's different emphasis on different phases and so forth, but the general logic is the same. You need to first of all start trying to build rapport. You also need to take care of particular requirements in different jurisdictions and communicate particular ground rules to children. So we know from research, for example, that it's important to tell someone, that they don't have to guess if they don't know the answer, and so forth. So some of that information is communicated to children. There's an emphasis very early on in interview protocols to build rapport. You need to, as an interviewer, create an atmosphere where you're warm and approachable, and one where a child can feel comfortable talking to you about some very serious issues and experiences that they've had. There's some sort of practice phase in many interview protocols, and then when the interviewer is ready, they're going to transition to investigating the alleged incidents. And this is where the interviewers need to use the open prompts, and then they need to collect sufficient evidence that can allow sometimes themselves and other professionals opportunities to make the right decision for those child. What should happen next based on what the child has said. In this interview protocol, there's a break. So after the interviewer has done their job, they've tried to find out as much as they can about all of the different incidents that the child is alleged to have happened. They will go and talk to a colleague in another room. The colleague would have been looking at the interview, maybe on closed circuit TV. They'll be taking some of the notes of their own. The interviewer is going to go into that room, see their colleague, and ask them, what have I missed? Are there any questions that I need to go back in and ask? And then there'll be some sort of immediate analysis and discussion between the person watching the interview and the person conducting it. They might return to the interview, ask a few more critical questions, and then there's a closure phase at the end of the interview, which we recommend should end with a neutral topic being discussed, so that the last thing the child is thinking about is not the topic of abuse that they've been describing. So it might be that the interviewer asks, what are you going to do for the rest of the day? And sometimes children will be able to tell you a little bit about what they plan to do, and then that's a nice way of getting their mind off the allegations that they've been talking about. I would recommend that you visit the NICHDprotocol.com website to have a look at this interview protocol. So if you want to take a moment just to pause the recording Go online, have a look at the protocol. It's published in lots of different languages, and then you'll get a feel for how it looks and how it has been designed. Okay, so if you've taken a moment to look at the NICHD protocol in full, what you would notice is that it is very structured. There is lots of very specific information about what interviewers should be saying in different parts of their interview. And this is an example from a transition phase that I was talking about earlier. So if you say to an interviewer, right, well, you've got to follow these phases, and they get to the transition, if you're that interviewer, what are you going to say? How do you transition? Well, through discussion with lots of experienced interviewers and trainers, legal experts, the developers of this protocol were able to hit on some good recommended ways to transition. So when the interviewer feels the time is right, they can say, now that I know you a little better, I want to talk about why you're here today. And then you can see here it gives quite a lot of instruction to the interviewer about what they should do next. So if the child starts to answer, wait. If the child gives a summary of the allegation, go to question 10. If the child doesn't make an allegation, continue with question 1. So it's, if you like, a type of decision-making tree. The interviewer has used this very neutral transition, and the interviewer has been given options about what they should do next. If the child doesn't say anything, there's some suggestions for other prompts. So this is only an excerpt of a very small part of the NICHD protocol, but if you read through the protocol, you'll get a feel for all of the different phases and the different sorts of things that interviewers are recommended to say at each phase. So, what are the changes that occur in interviewer behavior after the introduction of this protocol? So, the protocol would be introduced into existing training programs, and what it is introducing is very specific information about what interviewers can say at different times of the interview and different parts of the interview. So, does the protocol produce any improvements? Well, what we have here in the pie chart is data that's been conducted from research where the researchers have collected baseline data, and then the interviewers have been provided with NICHD protocol training, and then they have been able to provide examples of the interviews that they've conducted following the NICHD protocol training. So in this study here, this was conducted in Israel. About 100 interviewers provided examples of the interviews that they had been conducting prior to training, and we can see in the pie chart that only 6% of their utterances were invitations. And invitations is just another technical term for open prompts. So these are the types of prompts we really want to see interviewers using, and you can see that prior to the introduction of NICHD protocol training, very few open prompts are being used. Typical pattern, interviewers relying very heavily on these directive WH questions and option posing yes/no type questions. So the interviewers have been trained, and then they are able to all provide another example of their interviews. And you can see here that interviewers trained using the NICHD protocol are now able to use 30% open prompts. So this is quite a large improvement that you've seen, and this is very similar training to what you would otherwise receive, but the difference is that there has been the introduction of this highly structured interview protocol, and the results of this study are showing that it's produced an improvement in the number of open prompts. So this is data from Israel. Let's take a look at the same type of study that's been conducted in the United States. And this is another comparison between interviewers that have been trained without the NICHD protocol, so they're just receiving standard training. And these interviewers over here have been trained using the NICHD interview protocol. And you can see here it's the same type of things happened. The introduction of the protocol into training has caused an increase in the number of open prompts that are being used. And because the numbers of open prompts are increasing, what you also see is a decrease in the other types of prompts. So these can be a little bit more risky, these WH type questions and option posing questions. And so by using more of these open prompts, there was a need to use fewer of these risky prompts. Let's take a look at data from the United Kingdom. Again, without the introduction of the NICHD protocol, we had 7% open prompts. Following the introduction of the NICHD protocol, interviewers were able to use 34% open prompts, and then we see decreases in the numbers of risky prompts that are being deployed in the interview. Data from Canada, prior to the introduction of the NICHD protocol, 12% open prompts. Following the introduction of the NICHD protocol, that jumped up to 48%, and this is a very large increase. It's slightly larger than the other studies, but it is very, very good to see. This is data from colleagues that I work with in Chile. They're interested in looking at the same types of issues. They've spent a lot of time developing their own interview protocols, and they've also invested heavily in the training of forensic interviewers. And what we can see is in this type of study here, without the introduction of a forensic interview protocol, interviewers are using just over 18% open prompts, and when they've been trained to use a protocol in their interviews, that jumped up to almost 40%. So just by operationalizing an interview protocol within the training, it's producing higher quality interviews. I should say that this data from Chile is based on practice interviews that were conducted during the training. So it's not quite the same research, but it still illustrates the point. And this, at the time the study was conducted, was the best that the researchers in Chile were able to do, given the stage that they were at in the implementation of their interview guidelines. So we've seen improvements in the numbers of open prompts that are being used when the NICHD protocol was introduced into training systems. How does that help children? And what changes do we see in children's responses? So the data that I'm showing you here is the percentage of details that have been elicited using the different types of prompts. So this isn't depicting the percentages of the different types of prompts used by the interviewer. This is depicting the information provided by the child. And so looking at the same transcripts as the studies I've just showed you, and we now look through the lens of what is the child saying and where are they now providing their information. What we find in the Israel study is that when interviewers used very few open prompts, children were only able to provide a little bit of information in response to those, right? So 14% of what the child has said has come from the open prompts. After the protocol was introduced and interviewers were more comfortable using open prompts and were able to deploy more of them during the forensic interview, what we see is children now able to provide more than half of their testimony in response to open prompts. Now, I've gone into this issue in more detail in other slide presentations, so I'm just going to leave my explanation there at the moment. And the important take-home point is that you get quite a lot of benefit from using the open prompts. So even smaller increases in the use of open prompts it leads to quite dramatic increases in the way the child's able to tell their story, right? So they're able to tell their story much better when the interviewer starts using more open prompts. This is the data from Israel. Let's take a look at the data from the United States. You see exactly the same thing. When children participating in interviews where the interviewers don't use many open prompts, they aren't able to provide much information in response to them. But when interviewers do start using the open prompts, they're feeling comfortable doing that, what they start to get is much more information in response to those open prompts. So this information here is based on previous research, much more likely to be accurate than information provided from other prompt types. So this is, again, a very good and encouraging sign. Data in the United Kingdom is the same again. With the use of open prompts, what you find is a much larger amount of information provided by the child in response to them. So in the study, 55%, so that's more than half of the information provided by the child was in this very good category. And the data from Canada, 63% of the information in their research was provided by children in response to the open prompt. So that's most of it, and that is really quite good. So a structured approach to interviewing helps children of all ages tell their story, and that's an important conclusion that we can draw from this research. Now, for those of you who have looked at the NICHD protocol online, when people first look at it, they can sometimes be a little bit skeptical because it looks like a long script, and most people would think, well, we're not going to go and read a script to a child if they have something really important that they need to say. And I just like at this point ask you to spend some time reflecting on what the protocol is and what the protocol isn't. It's not meant to be a script that's read to children in a robotic fashion in a forensic interview. It's much better situated as a training tool that has been studied intensively, and that it's a training tool that we know is proven to work. So what you would hope is that using the protocol within training accelerates the performance of the forensic interviewers, and they start to get much clearer direction about what they should be saying and what they shouldn't be saying, and they become much more confident in using the open prompts as opposed to closed questions. So that's really good. And familiarizing yourself with all of the options that you've got, that is what we want to translate into the conducting of forensic interviews in the real world. So here's some points that we think are important regarding the structured NICHD protocol. First of all, using the same standardized approach with children has a number of advantages. It importantly levels the playing field. So if a child has been abused, what you would want is for them to be able to get help, and if an investigation is required, they need to be interviewed by well-trained and competent interviewers. And you don't want a lottery in that regard. You want to ensure that no matter where children go, no matter what police station that they go to, and no matter which interviewer they're speaking to, they're all going to get a same type of opportunity to be able to disclose or not disclose what they need to tell the interviewer. And the other good thing about the interview protocol is it minimizes personal biases. When interviewers conduct interviews, sometimes what you see is that they might have an idea in their head about what really happened, and that could be based on case characteristics or other types of cases that have been similar to them in the past. And it can sometimes you can see it's really obviously influenced their line of questioning, and so they probe for sorts of things that they're expecting to find, and they ignore other aspects. And so the good thing about using a standardized approach is that it kind of minimizes people's personal biases. So, and other biases can creep in to the manner that children are interviewed. For example, if you have an interviewer that deep down inside believes boys will be boys, how do you think that would influence and transfer into their style of forensic interviewing? If you have a interviewer that deep down inside believes that, girls that dress in a certain way are asking for trouble. Well, how do you think that's going to influence the conduct of a forensic interview? Right? It's going to introduce some deep-seated bias that is going to influence the line of questioning. And unfortunately, there's often not a lot we can do about, um, you know, people's biases, but we can, with this protocol, encourage people to use that, which restricts opportunities for lots of those biases to creep into the forensic interview. And also, it's important to remember that forensic interviewers sometimes lack self-awareness, right, about their own interview practices. And having a standardized format really helps us maintain desirable standards. It gives us a benchmark. It gives us something to point to. It gives us something that we can use to remind our forensic interviewers what's expected of them. Because often in the work life of a forensic interviewer, you'll go to work, you'll do your interview, and when the interview's done, often the interviewers are just going to want to put that out of their mind, and they're not going to spend a lot of time trying to reflect on how well they did and analyzing the types of questions that they asked and so forth. And I think that's understandable in lots of ways. So if we use a protocol, then yeah, that gives us the benchmark we need to be able to point people towards. And the other important thing to remember is that within psychology, quite often, single studies are produced and there's, interesting findings, and then people want to, make quite substantive changes to procedures, especially forensic ones within the criminal justice system. I have always tried to make sure that whatever I'm talking about is supported by more than just a single study. And the reason that I train the NICHD protocol is because of how well studied it is, and it's been studied in several different countries, and it's also been studied in many different jurisdictions with children speaking several different languages. And if we look across the studies, what we see is that the recommendations that the NICHD protocol makes has been validated in over 40,000 interviews around the world. So that's a very, very large sample size, especially within the field of psychology, which often has many fewer participants in research studies. So if we look across all of the studies that have been conducted, lots and lots of children have been involved. So we're pretty sure that children should be interviewed by trained specialists. I just want to make another comment about that training. That there has been a sort of kind of an evolution in thinking. So you can imagine if you were involved in research in the 1980s and 1990s about children's memory, and you've found out some important information about the types of questions that are going to elicit accurate information, you might think that in itself is enough. Shouldn't people then start changing their behaviors? Well, we know that that's not enough, right? Because we need another phase. We need to operationalize some of those recommendations. What's that going to look like in any one particular jurisdiction? And then we need to invest in the training of the interviewers. And what the research shows is that during that training, if we introduce interviewers to the NICHD protocol, they're going to get what it is that we want them to do a lot quicker. And then when we follow up their interviews, we're going to be able to see that they're able to put what they've learned into practice. And so that's resource intensive to that point. And it is very encouraging to see, initial improvements in the quality of interviews after the NICHD protocol has been introduced. But there is a additional element to the training that I'm going to end on. When interviewers have been trained to use the NICHD protocol, yes, their interview quality improves and we see more open prompts. So the next question researchers wanted to ask was how long are interviewers going to be able to conduct good interviews? And what they've found is that with the NICHD protocol training, what you typically find is initial improvements. But if you go back 6 months later, interviewers are conducting interviews the way that they always have. They sort of revert back to baseline, if you think if you want to think about it like that. So before training, and this study here by Michael Lamb in 2002, we've got a pretty standard set of findings, right? It's just asking the question, what is the questioning like in interviews when no NICHD protocol was used? Very few open prompts. And then here, what we have is additional pie charts that have sort of followed up some of those interviewers. So here we've got NICHD training with no CPD feedback. Now CPD is continual professional development. So this is what it looks like when interviewers go on a training program. They're shown the NICHD protocol. They probably leave able to conduct interviews that would be in line with the recommendations of the NICHD protocol. But when we come back 6 months or a year later, that's it. They generally conduct interviews that are no different to the interviews that they conducted before they were trained. So these data here are depicting what happens when some time has passed following training, but interviewers each receive personalized continual professional development feedback. So these interviewers would have gone on the training program. They would have been exposed to the NICHD protocol. And then when they finished the training, they kept in contact with their trainers and managers. And every month they would submit another interview and sit down and have a detailed, reflective talk about the quality of their interview, what went well, where they can improve, and so forth. And with that process continuing every month, for many, many months, if you were to go back and then look at the quality of the interviews, what you find here is this effect here where the interviewers are using a much larger percentage of open prompts in their interviews. And so this tells us that if we want to see interviewers able to conduct good interviews, especially around the questioning, we need to invest in not just 1 week long training programs and not simply exposing interviewers to the NICHD protocol at that time, but we also need to commit to working with interviewers, throughout their career so that they're always developing their skills. And what we know is that interviewers that do that, interviewers that get this personalized feedback from experienced colleagues, they can go from being good interviewers to extraordinarily good interviewers over the course of years when they do the work. And that's what we hope to achieve as we move forward, is to keep the commitment and resources going into the care and feedback of the forensic interviewers as well. Moving forward, I will have another slide presentation on the revised NICHD protocol. This presentation has been on much of the early work and the different stages that the researchers and practitioners have gone through in developing their ideas.